Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecturette about pragmatics. Pragmatics is an entire field of study that we could devote an entire course or several to, but we won't. But it interacts with the semantics in a very important way. And the way that it interacts is not as clear-cut as the distinction in names might suggest, but we'll be employing pragmatic notions and pragmatic phenomena quite a bit in the semantics. They are used not only to help explain how meaning works, but they're also a very useful diagnostic tool. We've seen some of it already, and we will continue to throughout the course. So what is pragmatics? Well, essentially, pragmatics can be thought of as the study of the meaning of language as it is used. And it also refers to the phenomena itself, of course. So when we say as it's being used, that's a contrast with semantics, which focuses on the meaning that is in the expressions themselves and the way that those meanings combine in the linguistic structure. Whereas pragmatics is really focused on the meaning of the expression in an utterance. So a lot of pragmatic meaning involves reference to these utterances. And a number of the pragmatic, another feature of pragmatic meaning is that it is generally unspoken. So a lot of the meaning that we have in our utterances is semantic, but a very good deal of it is absolutely left to these pragmatic principles. And the pragmatics help us complete this sense of meaning and also lead to a lot of confusion because these are unspoken and generally unwritten kinds of meanings. Just to give you a simple example, right? When you are at the table and you ask someone, "Can you pass the salt?" That linguistic expression has a semantic meaning, and it's a yes or no question, right? Is it possible, or are you able to pass the salt? But that's not really what you meant, right? What you really meant was a request for the salt. Can I have the salt? Give me the salt. But it's not polite to say, "Hey, give me the salt," or "salt me," But it is polite to say, "Can you give me the salt?" So you ask a question you know the answer to, but in doing so, we make an indirect request. And a large part of cultural knowledge involves that, knowing that this particular question actually means something else in a context where it makes sense. So at the dinner table, "Can you pass the salt?" means, "Give me the salt, please." But if we were, say, at a rehabilitation center and you had lost the use of your hands and you were regaining them, and I asked you, "Can you pass the salt?" then it might be an actual informational question. And in that case, the context of the utterance would shape the way that the pragmatics came about. So another good example, one we do in class all the time, if I ask, "Hey, does anyone know who the first president of the United States was?" And, in a normal classroom in the US, you raise your hand and, I pick on you and you say, "George Washington." Correct, that's the right answer. But again, we have a pragmatic effect. The question was, does anybody know who the first president was? And that's a yes or no question. So semantically, the value of that question is yes or no, and so an exact literal answer would be yes or no. But it's a bit ridiculous. Why would I ask if anyone knows? It's not an informative question. And of course the answer is yes, because there's somebody out there who knows who the first president was. And so, what I'm asking is not really what I'm asking. And it requires a little bit of cultural knowledge to understand that difference. Right? Anyone who's gone to school in an English-speaking country will know this convention. But if you haven't, then you might not, and other languages don't do that. And so, I've had the experience teaching in another country and asking that question, and the students give me this weird look because I asked this question that's a bit ridiculous on the face of it. But that's how pragmatics works. There's a lot of meaning that is really tied to cultural expectations of situational context. And the pragmatics is often acquired by native speakers many years after the syntax, phonology, and even much of the meaningful semantics. So, the pragmatics relies on a lot of different ways of interpreting things to get a real meaning out of it. So I'll talk about some of them here, and each of these will have their own lecture lesson. But just to introduce them, so one major element of pragmatics is called presupposition. And a presupposition is a proposition that that another proposition's semantic meaning depends on. So presuppositions often come about through what are called triggers. A good one is the word again. So the word again presupposes that the proposition, the rest of the sentence, has happened before. So if you say, if I see you with a wrecked car and I say, oh, you wrecked your car again, then my use of again presupposes that you have wrecked your car in the past. If you haven't wrecked your car in the past, then it's not even clear that my sentence is even false. It's certainly not true. So its meaning depends on accepting the proposition that you've done this before. Implicature is a proposition that you can infer based on the truth of a proposition. Classic example, if I say, if we're talking about a class and I say, oh, how did your students do? And you say, oh, most of them passed. Well, that's true, okay. But what you don't say is that there are some that failed. Now it might seem obvious, well yeah, if you had said, if all of them passed, you would have said all. Well, you would have, right? But you didn't have to. If all of your students passed, then it's also true that most of your students passed. But the fact that all is more informative than most suggests that by saying most, I'm also allowing, that's the most informative I can be. So when I say most, you can infer that all is not true. And now we can call the proposition all the student, it's not true that all the students passed. We can call that an implicature. And we use implicatures all the time to resolve meanings and to understand things that weren't said. Sometimes we use it in a mischievous way, right? So if, when politicians like to say things like, oh, mistakes were made, right? In that case, they leave out the agent. And by doing so, again, through informativity, you can infer that they were not the agent of these mistakes. Or that nobody was the agent. They just happened. And in either case, the politician is absolved of blame. That is the implicature they're hoping you draw. And but because they're implicating it and not actually saying it, then they can come back and say that they weren't lying, right? They never said that they didn't make a mistake. They just implicated it. A speech act is another important facet of pragmatics. Speech acts are a way of classifying different utterances based on, the effect that they have. So we have utterances like assertions, which make a statement about the world. We have questions, which inquire about the world. But we also have speech acts that do more active things. There's commands, the classic imperatives, and then the various types of weaker imperatives like uses and hortatives and all these other crazy things. There are different what are called performatives as well, speech acts that actually change things. So when a judge declares, "I now pronounce you man and wife," right, by uttering that sentence, the status of the two, of the bride and the groom, their status is now changed in the eyes of the law. Right? So performatives are a really important kind of speech act. There are a lot of other kinds of speech acts as well, and the study of these and their meaning falls a lot under pragmatics. Deixis involves the reference, direct reference, to the world around the utterance. Simple example, a word like "here" is, we call that deictic, because it's referring to the location of the utterance. Or the demonstratives, this versus that, and so forth. And the way that deictic systems are encoded in different languages is an interesting matter, not only for the study of particular languages, but for typological studies and even studies of universals. And then we have idioms, which some people don't put into pragmatics. I'm more of a notion that they tend to be pragmatic in nature, like we saw with, does anybody know the answer? Right? The actual meaning in there is idiomatic. But for an idiom like, kick the bucket, what we see is that it has a literal compositional meaning, but then there's an added meaning on top of it. And so one of the questions that we want to ask is, to what extent is the idiomatic meaning of kick the bucket semantic versus pragmatic? But in any case, a lot of different issues come together when we're looking at pragmatics, and it's an important aspect of semantics as a result. And we'll be employing these notions as diagnostics and as interesting facets of study themselves.